There two are the main questions, if you like. One is to actually look at the interaction between these two fields, the Weyl field, which is the gravitational waves, and the Maxwell field, which electromagnetic waves or magnetic fields, large-scale magnetic fields.
Excuse me, please. What is the definition of Weyl field?
I will come to that a little bit later. So.
It is not spin half.
No. Effectively, graviton. Yeah, if you look at
graviton spin half.
If you look at gravitational waves in the quantum sense, then they are gravitons. Okay,
so it is not a Weyl spinor, which are used for description of neutrino and other particles.
No.
It's other.
No, not that.
Not that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So one is this. One question is this: to see the interaction between these two fields, and if there is some possible transfer of energy from one to the other. In particular, to see whether there is a chance of energy being transferred from gravitational waves to electromagnetic fields, and more specifically whether it is possible for gravitational waves to amplify electromagnetic or magnetic fields, and more specifically if there is a chance of resonant strong amplification. So let me start with the gravitational waves, what they are. They are ripples in the fabric of the space-time that propagate at the speed of light. And effectively what you have is you put matter in one location, you distort it a little bit. These distortions propagate in every direction. And this is the so-called long-range gravitational field, gravity acting from a distance. And how do we describe mathematically these gravitational waves? There is the standard description, which is metric-based. So you get a space-time, a metric that doesn't contain gravitational waves, so it's eta there, the Minkowski metric, for example. And then you perturb a little bit with the H tensor, and you have gravitational wave perturbations. You can study them this way. Well, that's the standard description, the one used more commonly by people. I'm not going to use that. I'm going to use another one, which is actually employed by a particular formalism, which is known as the 1+3 covariant description or approach to relativity and cosmology. And what this actual formalists do is use a particular part of the curvature of the space-time to describe gravitational waves. And this is the Weyl field. So I suppose I can write something on the
Please, A and B four-dimensional flat indices or curved indices.
This is Minkowski, effectively.
This is A and B Minkowski indices.
That's right, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the other is the gravitational wave in this approach. So we have the Riemann field, which describes the full curvature of the space-time, the full gravitational field, if you like. And then this splits into the Ricci field, which describes the local curvature or the local gravitational field. So you put matter somewhere, it distorts the geometry there. That's the local gravitational field, and this actually goes into the Einstein field equations. And then you have the Weyl field, which describes how local curvature actually propagates, distortions in the local curvature propagate in the fabric of the space. And this is what we'll actually use. Okay, so this is the long-range gravitational field, describes gravitational waves and tidal forces, gravity acting from a distance.
The Riemann was rank 4, right? And Ricci rank 2.
That's a 2, and this is 4, but splits into 2, these two tensors. I will come to that. Okay, so this is a covariant tensor, actually, in the sense that it is the same for all observers living in the space-time. But when you introduce a family of observers, then you can split it in two additional or two separate fields. And one is the so-called electric Weyl tensor, and the other is the so-called magnetic Weyl tensor. And they are symmetric and phase-free. These angled brackets here, when they apply two tensors mean that they are symmetric and they also have trace 0. And if you want to study with these tensors gravitational waves, then you have to impose an additional condition. You have to make sure that there are divergence there. This is the three-dimensional covariant derivative operator, that both divergences are 0. Then you can study gravitational waves. Yeah.
And you spoke about Weil and Ricci in terms of space scales, or at least local versus long range.
That's right.
Can you asymptotically extract the Ricci field from the Weil field?
You can see how curvature here, curvature distortion here affects another point in space. If this is what you mean, yes. If it's not, I'm not sure.
Well, I guess I'm thinking about myself as an observer. So if I see a short-range fluctuation, I need to describe it. I'm going to use Ricci, right? If I'm living on a length scale of, say, the fluctuation in space-time. If I'm far away, I'm somewhere else, and I watch this happen, the way in which I see it is Weil. So the question is, how do I go? Can I go rigorously
You mean if
from
you
one
see
to the other?
If you see the ripples, the distraction, the distortion of space-time coming to you, okay, then it propagates to the Weil field. Okay. If you're standing at a point and you feel the local curvature there, then what you feel is the Ricci field. Okay.
Yeah, and I completely understand that, and my question is, can I get from one to the other asymptotically?
I mean, you would naively think, I thought, that Weil and
Asymptotically,
Ricci,
this will go to 0. Okay. The local curvature asymptotically far away, you won't be there. Okay.
Yeah.
So what do you mean, can I go from one to the other?
I mean, is one description mathematically an asymptotic limit of the other one?
No, I wouldn't say that.
Okay.
I mean, they're two separate fields.
orthogonal projections of the Riemann tensor onto the Riemann tensor. So
These are splitting, actually. You can
that's
split.
right. So they
There are two different fields in this respect. No. You
So
cannot.
that's
Okay, so I get it.
Yeah.
You answered my question.
All right. So I mentioned before that these are actually the components of the Weil tensor that observers actually see. So let me put something more on the board about these observers, because it's a basic step, fundamental step for this approach. So what we do is actually,
Excuse me, please.
Yeah.
I'm not specialist in this definition. Can I ask you, Riemann tensor includes both fields?
Correct.
Gravitational fields and electromagnetic fields, yes?
no. This is gravity alone.
It is gravitational, but
Okay.
what does
These are gravitational waves,
This is gravitational waves.
all tidal forces.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the local curvature. So this is long range, this is actually how curvature propagates. And this is the local curvature. At some point that we should put some up. Okay.
Thank you.
there's
So,
also something like extrinsic and intrinsic. That has nothing to do with that, right?
no, there is a different decomposition of, for the Riemann tensor where you can get the intrinsic and the extrinsic. And this depends again on the observer.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
So you have them both in both of Weil and Ricci, of course.
you can have extrinsic and intrinsic. So some parts of that go to the intrinsic, some parts go to the extrinsic indirectly. Okay. So it defines a family of observers. Okay. Let's put it this way. And these are the world lines of the observers. So these define tangent to these world lines is the vector, full vector, which is the full velocity of the observer.
Please, you told that in the last equation, you told that B is three-dimensional index, but you have four-dimensional index. You told that this is
What B?
divergence of E equals 0 divergence.
Spatial projection, yeah?
You're talking about-
No, the last equation, yes. A and B four-dimensional.
That's right, it's three-dimensional, okay, so all these tensors are three-dimensional.
Three-dimensional.
Yeah, that's right, they live in the observer's rest
Yes,
space.
because
I
on
will-
the first line you have AB as four-dimensional.
Yeah, this is the four-dimensional metric, okay.
Yes, that's right, but.
So this is, you mean that this can take 1, 0, 1 plus 3, and this can take 1 plus 3 only, that's the
Yes,
problem?
you have the same indices
That's
in
all right.
different dimensions.
Yeah, that's okay.
I'm sorry.
He would be used to having different ones.
Yes, and that's how we do it anyway, so I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
All right, so this is.
So practically, you will work with three-dimensional indices in your picture. or-
Yeah, effectively, these are three
Because it's
tensors.
rather-
They live in the observer's rest space, but let me come to that, it will become probably
Sorry,
more clear.
yeah,
in a
okay,
second.
sorry.
So this is a time lag for velocity field, okay. So what we do, we define, these are the world lines of the observers, so these world lines actually define their time direction for these observers. And then what we do, we go and project orthogonal to these world lines using a specific tensor, it's not the time to show it. And then we get a three-dimensional surface, and this is the observer's rest space. Supposedly this is normal here. Okay, so once we get down to this decomposition where the basic actual direction is that of time, and then subsequently we define the space, that's why we call it 1 plus 3. We can go ahead and decompose everything with respect to these two, to this direction effectively. Okay, we can decompose equations, quantities, operators, everything. All right. So for observers like that, this is how the Weyl tensor splits. They see this and they see this, and these two tensors actually live on this three-dimensional space. So if you like, they are normal to the flow velocity. Okay. And of course, these two tensors are, like I said again, sort of
But now we mix 4 tensors with 3.
yeah, okay, this is 0. So if you want to put numbers down here, this will be 0, and
Yes.
the quantities that have actually 0 here will
Okay.
will be.
So H00 is always 0, I mean.
Yeah, it can be a bit confusing, but
Yeah.
we use it
Okay.
like that.
Yeah, I understand.
So, right.
So, but of course you can fix your gauge and you can fix your gauge and fixing the component of the vector UB.
Oops.
You prefer to work in how to say in four-dimensional covariant description.
That's right. Yeah. That's what you can actually introduce coordinates if you want.
No, I mean that it's rather how to say unusual to see the same index which has three-dimensional and four-dimensional situation.
But now the indices are 4-dimensional, it's just that the metric itself.
Yes, they're four-dimensional, but
Zero.
Effectively, yes.
Yes.
But in practice,
Yeah.
the tensor is three-dimensional.
Yeah.
So, where was I?
equation should be covariant with respect to general relativity transformation.
Yeah.
And
That's-
covariance, I don't know, isn't object for attention in this science, for example, for how to say, quantum field theory theoretician, it's rather important to have generally covariant equation.
Well, these are covariant,
This
provided,
is a covariant equation.
provided we
Yes.
have introduced an observer.
Mhm.
So it's not exactly covariant in the sense that it's the same for every observer.
Mhm.
But you introduce an observer, but the observer is random, so it doesn't make any difference if you go to a different one. Okay. All right. So in order to describe gravitational waves properly, you need to use these two tensors. Now, this is not always necessary, fortunately, however, because if you are in a space or perturb a space that is highly symmetric, for example, if you perturb Minkowski space, or if you perturb an FRW universe, then you only have to use the shear. So both of these tensors, the electric and the magnetic Weyl components, actually are directly related to the shear, and I will show you this later. So you can just use the shear in order to study gravitational waves to linear order on symmetric spacetimes like these two examples. And the shear by construction is a symmetric interest-free tensor, and of course, in order to make sure that you are describing gravitational waves, pure tensor perturbations, you have to make sure, you have to impose that last condition there, that the divergence of the shear is actually 0. I will come back a bit later to say a bit more about what the shear actually describes, but and some other kinematic quantities, we will see them a bit later. But for the moment, let me say that in order to talk about gravitational waves, you have to make sure that you have isolated the pure tensor perturbations. So the tensors that you have, or from the tensors that you have left in your space-time, you cannot construct neither a vector nor a scalar. So the fact that the shear, for example, is trace-free means you cannot make a scalar this way by taking the trace. The fact that it has 0 divergence means that you cannot make a vector either. Okay, so it's a pure tensor. So it's gravitational waves. So your perturbations are not contaminated by, say, vector perturbations, vorticity perturbations, for example, or by scalar perturbations, like density perturbation. Okay. So you have to make sure, yeah?
But you talk about the background, right? That's only the background.
No, this is to linear order.
It's the extra perturbation. But
Yeah.
then you don't include any, I mean, suppose you did some...
Yeah, you switch off the
Some-
vorticity. I'm
I mean,
coming to
suppose
this.
you have some rotation in the space-time.
You have to switch it off from your equations to make sure that your equations are dealing only with gravitational waves. Otherwise, you might have contamination from other sources, and the results may actually be
I
not.
mean, are you saying they would not introduce any gravitational waves? Anything? Rotational perturbation?
Not really. No, to linear order. No. Okay. So,
Excuse me, please, but if you have sigma AB, you are able to consider determinant sigma, determinant shear. And determinant shear will be transformed as density. And then you could divide by determinant of metric and
you
will
mean
have
to take
scalar.
the determinant of the shear?
Yes, if you consider determinant
Yeah.
of shear and divided it by determinant of metric JA, you will find scalar.
That's an interesting question. Possibly the issue is that when you take the determinant of the shear, you get actually a quantity which is of higher order if you consider it as a perturbation.
Yes, that's right.
So,
You can also square the tensor, right? It also gives you...
yeah, but you go to higher order if you assume that the shear is first order perturbation.
Yeah, I see.
Okay. So, so these are the conditions.
So sigma includes some, I'm sorry.
I will
Sigma
come to
includes-
the shear a little bit
Uh-huh.
later. So, let's keep going. I will actually explain what it means using this diagram. So these are the conditions that you have to impose. You have to make sure that these tensors are divergence-free. They're already trace-free, like I said. So if you are on these backgrounds, you perturb on these backgrounds to linear order, so you don't keep higher order terms, second order or higher, then the conditions you have to impose are the following. So you have no acceleration for acceleration. You have no vorticity, and I will come back to the others afterwards. So 0 for acceleration means that these world lengths are actually geodesics, which means that you don't have forces in your system apart from gravity, which in relativity is not a force anyway. And 0 vorticity means that you don't have any vector perturbation, so you have switched off your vorticity. You don't allow your space-time to rotate. And then you also switch off perturbations in the density, or the density of the matter, if you assume that you have matter in your system. And you also switch off perturbations in the expansion. Theta there is the scalar that describes the expansion or the contraction of your space-time. So if theta is positive, you have expansion. If it's negative, you have contraction. Okay. So once you have done this, you have made sure that these conditions actually work. Okay. And then you have isolated your gravitational waves. Now, this is not only enough, however, because you can do it in the initial hypersurface. You can isolate your gravitational wave, but as you evolve this hypersurface, it's possible that these conditions are not enough. In the next hypersurface, you may have to add another condition, and later maybe another. If this happens, then you cannot isolate your gravitational waves consistently. There is a problem. Now, fortunately, when your space-time is simple or symmetric, if you like, then these conditions, for example, for the Minkowski and the FW case, these conditions are enough. You set them initially, they are enough to maintain that gravitational waves isolated at all times.
But not for any conformal flat space.
Not for any space.
Only for Friedman-Robertson.
Definitely for this, probably for some other ones, I don't know, but generally no, they are not enough. Okay.
And there's an AA is what?
It's the four acceleration, so it's effectively the acceleration, you can
Yes.
say. Okay.
So I mean, when I talk about conformal flat space, I mean that the conformal factor should depend of time, as in Friedman-Robertson, for example. Or it is essential for your.
Well, that's, I think even if the conformal factor does not depend on time, for example, if your FRW model is closed or open, the conformal factor is not only time dependent, it has a spatial dependence. But I think even in that model, but I'm not 100% sure, these conditions are still enough because the model is still very symmetric. Okay. But there is a question mark on that. Maybe it's not like that. I'm not sure. I think so. So, am I done? Okay, so I suppose that's enough about the gravitational waves. So let's see how we describe electromagnetic fields, again in this approach. Now the standard approach, in inverted commas, is to use the electromagnetic tensor, the Faraday tensor, which is an antisymmetric tensor there, and use the four current, and then study the evolution of the electromagnetic fields using Maxwell's equations there. Okay. We won't do that. We will do what we do in the covariant approach. So again, we introduce this family of observers, like here. And then for these observers, once we have introduced these observers, we will use the electric and the magnetic fields that these observers measure, because they don't actually measure the Faraday tensor, and the charge density and the free current that they actually see. Okay, and how can we actually write these things down? This is how the Faraday tensor decomposes relative to an observer from this family. So you see here is the electric field, that's the magnetic field, and that's the photo velocity of the observer. That's how the four current splits. Mu is the charge density, and the other is the free current, the current that lives on these hypersurfaces. Of course, both the electric and the magnetic field live on the three-dimensional hypersurface. Now, in the same way, we can split up the Maxwell's equations, and if we do that, we get four equations instead of two.
And it's like the epsilon ABC.
This is the Levi-Civitati.
Yeah, but it goes. This is I thought go from 0 to 3 now. Did they include 0? No.
From up to 3.
Or they only include 3.
Not this one.
No.
Okay, it's not this one. This is the three-dimensional.
Yes.
Okay.
But the
There is the four-dimensional,
but
which
the
is
FAB it must be 4 by 4, no?
you'll get the zero terms from here.
It doesn't exist in the message.
You get the zero terms from here if you want.
It is antisymmetric.
Okay. This is the time-like part, if you like.
Yeah.
And this is the space-like part,
Yeah,
if you
but this
fancy.
FAB, I mean, normally you have that. on the
If you write it down, it will come out nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can store a zero component in front A in epsilon. Zero component.
Yeah, the zero component, I don't know if we say the same thing, it will come from this term. This term doesn't have any zero component. Okay, it will give you
Yes.
the other,
That's the other.
the 3 by 3 matrix that is inside.
Right. So isn't it then correct? The FAB has orthoid.
Yeah.
Is it? Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Okay, because this one has 4.
Yeah. Okay. So it's just 0 then.
It was my remark to use the correct notation. Three-dimensional.
I get it now. So
I'm
it's always 0
The
then.
demonstration of the, how to say.
Yeah.
Okay, so we split the Maxwell's equations, okay, and this is how they look. This is, if you like, the covariant, the 1+3 covariant version of these laws, okay. And if you look at these version of Maxwell's equations, you will notice that in addition to the usual terms, I mean the time derivatives, dots are time derivatives, of course. In addition to the time derivatives, the curl terms, the div terms, you get additional extra terms, which actually are related to kinematic variables, theta, sigma, omega is the vorticity, the forward acceleration. Okay, and these are relative motion terms. Why do you get them? You get them because your space-time is not generally static. Okay, so which means that these world lengths of these observers actually can move relative to each other, although they correspond to the same velocity field. For example, suppose that you have this bunch of world lines, okay? It's like a bunch of wires, you may say, and you cut a cross-sectional area. Suppose that is like this. Okay? Now, although these observers do not have their own individual motion, something like a peculiar velocity, if you like, one relative to the other, if your space-time is actually non-static, they will move relative to each other. So, for example, if your space-time is expanding, then this cross-sectional area will increase. Okay, or if it is contracting, it will decrease. Okay, and this effect will come through this step here. That includes the theta. Okay, if your space-time is rotating by itself, okay, then these world lines will start rotating relative to each other, and this effect will come from here. Also, if there is some kind of distortion, deformation, then this cross-sectional area will change shape. Okay, it may be a nice spherically symmetric in the beginning, then it becomes something more complicated. These are described by the shear, these type of deformations. The shear describes changes in the shape and the constant volume, because the volume actually changes are given by theta. And finally, if you have forces in your model, then these world lines won't be geodesics. They will move differently somehow, and these effects will come through the forward acceleration. Okay, so you have a bunch of relative motion effects because these observers may be moving not because of their own motion, but because the space-time is actually non-static. Okay, generally it is not. If it is static, all these terms will go away. Okay. Now, for our purposes,
So the angle brackets means simply that you are subtracting the divergences, yeah? So it's the
no,
vertices.
this means that I have projected this quantity on my rest space. So this is actually because E, this is this as a time-like component, okay? But I only do my measurements on my rest space, so I have to project it on my rest space. So I do it using the projection tensor,
Yeah,
which is
QA,
and I,
QB, yeah?
so this is okay.
Yeah.
So effectively, I kill off any time-like component that this E dot has. Okay.
Mhm.
So everything there is three-dimensional.
Mhm.
All right. So now these relative motion terms are important for our purposes because effectively the more important one, the most important one is this shear. Because as I said before, gravitational waves always generate shear perturbations. Okay, they change the shape of your space, if you like. And they can also be described in certain situations just by the shear. So if you want to study how gravitational waves affect electromagnetic fields, we have to actually concentrate on these terms. This is how the effects of gravitational waves actually propagate, actually affect the electromagnetic field through Maxwell's equations, and in particular through these two terms. Not exclusively, but essentially. All right. So these are the terms that we will focus in the future. Okay.
So the Gauss law,
Yeah. There's no zero in the right hand side. Okay.
I'm just wondering why there's
This
no
is
sigma.
because. Huh?
Why is there no sigma?
It's because there's no. It has to do if you get an effective magnetic charge if there is rotation and there is an electric field as well. In the same way that you get an effective electric charge if there is rotation. Okay. So it's a relative motion effect. It's not a real charge, of course. Okay. So, all right. So this is. I think I'm going too slow. This is how we describe generally the electromagnetic fields in this way. So let's now move and see how the gravitational waves that we have seen before affect the electromagnetic waves. I said the main effects come through the shear terms here. So first of all, we'll try to choose a background to study this interaction, and we'll start with the simplest possible background, and this is Minkowski space, which is empty, it is static, and it is flat. Okay, and then we perturb this with gravitational waves. We can only use the shear. There's no need to go to the Weyl component exclusively or explicitly. And to linear order, the shear satisfies this simple wave equation. Okay, where this square there is the covariant, the three-dimensional covariant Laplacian operator. Okay, and again, I have forgotten to fit angled brackets there in this. There should be some angled brackets here because this is projected again. Okay, although to linear order you don't actually need it. So in order to solve this equation, we usually get rid of the Laplacian, okay, the partial derivatives. And what we usually do, what we always do actually, is assume this kind of harmonic splitting. So we use pure tensor harmonics, this Q here. These tensor harmonics actually contain the spatial dependence of the shear. And they are symmetric and trace free. They are also divergence free and satisfy, this is the tensor version of what we call the Laplace-Beltrami equation. K is the wave number of the shear perturbation, of the shear of the wave. So 1 over K is the wavelength. All right, and once you take this decomposition, you put it back in, you get rid effectively of the spatial dependence.
Yeah. What does mean the first equation? V is sigma is
this one.
GA sigma K.
Yeah, this means that this quantity
Mm-hmm.
has only time dependence.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and all the spatial dependence is here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I put it in.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Okay.
It's rather important to solve this equation, this splitting. It is.
Yeah.
So it is some ansatz, or it is.
It is. Yeah,
It is some
yeah,
ansatz.
yeah.
It is not general.
We assume that we can split actually the dependence. Okay.
In principle, so generally you could not split.
Yeah, that's right. This is what we do in
So you
cosmology.
should do is that at that point you start to use some special ansatz for your.
Yeah, you can say that. Okay. Although I don't know how familiar you are with cosmological perturbation studies. That's standard.
That's standard.
That's standard. Yeah. So you try to look at the time evolution of the quantity. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So if you do that, you come up with this expression. Okay. This has become this, and then you can solve it, and you get this simple wave. The amplitude in the phase can be calculated from the initial conditions. So more or less, you do the same for your electromagnetic waves. Again, your space, the background space is Minkowski. Again, you keep only linear terms. You have these two simple equations. You do the same splitting. Now you use vector harmonics, these Q's. Okay. They have no time dependence. They are pure vectors, so you cannot, the divergence is 0. And they satisfy an analogous equation. This is the vector Laplace-Beltrami equation. And n is the wave number of your electromagnetic wave. Okay. And again, you put it back, this decomposition, you put it back to the original wave equations. They look like that. You can solve them. You get this solution. Right. So effectively what we have Minkowski space, and we throw in linear perturbations in the form or in the shape of electromagnetic signal, if you like, and a gravitational wave. And then we would like to see the interaction of these two waves. Okay. Of course, the interaction we will look at the second order, higher order. Okay. So in particular, we throw the gravitational wave on the electromagnetic signal. It hits it, in inverted commas. It produces a new electromagnetic signal after the interaction. The electromagnetic wave shoots chains, and I would like to see how this interaction affects the electromagnetic wave. And if we do that, the new electromagnetic wave actually satisfies these wave equations. Now, the right-hand sides are not 0, but have a number of source terms. Okay. E and B are the new components, the components of the new wave, if you like. E tilde and B tilde are the components of the original wave. And CR, of course, describes the gravitational wave.
And nu, you mean second order?
That's right, the second order. So all these expressions are second. This is second order, first order means second order, and so on. Okay.
Excuse me, please, but what is the perturbation parameter for expansion when you tell the second order? What do you mean?
Well, in the standard way, we'll have E, and we'll keep terms of order E squared. Okay. So that's what we do here. So for example, this is a perturbation, this is a linear perturbation. So next to it you can put an E term. Okay. This is also a linear perturbation, you can put another E term next to it, this is E squared. Okay. And so on and so forth. Okay.
So you suppose that E is rather small.
That's right, E is rather small, yeah. Okay, that's good. So at the end there you can see that the electric and the magnetic parts of the Weyl tensor appear. And also here you have perturbations in the three-dimensional curvature. Of course, the space is Minkowski in the beginning, so there is no curvature perturbation, but once you have perturbed, there is some kind of small curvature perturbation, and this pops up there. Okay. Like I said before, however, you do not actually have to use explicitly these terms, because your space-time, your background space-time, and your linear space-time is very symmetric. And you can see that from these auxiliary linear relations. To first order, the curvature perturbation is nothing else but the electric part of the Weyl tensor. And the electric part of the Weyl tensor is nothing else but the time derivative of the shear. And the magnetic part of the Weyl tensor is nothing else but the curl of the shear. So if I know the shear, I know the other things. I can make the replacement, I can keep only the shear. Okay, and I do that. And things simplify substantially, but not enough. So these are the equations now that describe to second order the interaction between gravitation and electromagnetic waves, and in particular the effects of the phenomena on the latter, to second order on a Minkowski background. As you see, you have forced oscillation. Okay, and the driving sources are there, gravitomagnetic driving sources.
So you have these auxiliary equations. Do they have anything to do with gauge freedom that you have to begin with?
No, we don't use any kind of gauge here. The analysis, actually, I didn't mention, is completely gauge invariant.
Yes.
Okay, so I don't really care about what gauge I have. Okay, because there is a theorem that tells me, actually, guarantees to me that the results of this study are gauge invariant, because I'm using quantities which actually vanish in the background. And there is a theorem that tells you that if your quantity vanishes in the background, then the perturbation is gauge invariant. Okay. So I don't have to care about it at all, which is nice.
When you are talking about gauge invariance, which gauge do you mean?
I don't
Gauge
need
connected with electromagnetic interactions?
not the gauge, not a Coulomb gauge, something like that.
Gravitation
No.
waves, I thought.
Not that.
No,
Gauge
it's,
in the sense of cosmological perturbation theory. So you assume a particular connection between your background space-time and your perturbed space-time, and you fix it, and then all your results correspond to this particular gauge. If you want to go to a different gauge, you have to make the transformation and see when you get there. Okay. If you don't fix it completely, then your results may be gauge dependent. Even worse, you don't know there is a gauge freedom, which you always have to check what it means in practice. Now, with this approach, you don't have to consider to worry about this at all. Your results are completely gauge invariant.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, they are to second order, this equation here. What about infinite order?
Yeah, effectively, when you increase the order of your perturbation, there is no theory. Okay.
So you cannot go beyond that easily.
No. The
Well,
more you increase your perturbation level, the worse it gets. Okay. As you expect.
Yeah. You
Okay.
may not need that, I think.
Depends.
Well, it just redefines the background.
Yeah, in a
I
sense.
mean, so
Yeah.
if you go to higher order, then what you'd find as the background has to
Yeah,
change.
that's right.
So it would be, I mean, given that you're just doing perturbation theory for wave equations, a couple wave equations, it would seem that you could renormalize this to account for the definition of the background at whatever order of perturbation theory you're doing.
You mean
So
that the second order your background is the first order and third order?
Exactly.
Yeah, you can do
Yeah.
that. Yeah. In principle, at least I would think that you can do something. So these describe a forced oscillation, and okay, because of that, you immediately, or you can think that because forced oscillations actually provide the stage, the natural stage for resonances, then you might think, okay, is there any chance that these equations here actually contain resonant solutions? Okay, and and I'm talking about analytical solutions. You cannot solve this equation analytically, or at least I couldn't. So what I did is get rid of some nasty terms with some kind of argument. And the argument was that I will go to this electric wave equation and drop all the terms that have the magnetic field inside, and then go to the magnetic and drop all the terms that have the electric field inside. So in a way, you can say that I'm ignoring back reaction, how the one field back reacts on the other. And if I do that, they simplify like this, and they have actually decoupled. And now this system can be solved. Okay. So this is the new gravitation, this is the new electromagnetic wave. That's the old, and that's the gravitational wave. Okay. And the equations are very similar. Effectively, it's one equation. So the next thing is now to actually see the properties, if we can get any idea of the properties of the new wave, qualitatively at least. Okay. So to make things even simpler, we will assume that the original waves are monochromatic. Okay. So we have these tensor harmonics for the gravitational wave. That's the wave number of the radiation. We have these expressions for the electromagnetic wave, and that's the wave number of the original electromagnetic wave. Now, if you go back to your interaction equations, you see that you have some cross terms here. So you have a QAB here and a QB there. So effectively, if you do the decomposition, you get terms like this. This is a contraction of the tensor with a vector. And this gives you a vector, of course. And it is easy to show that this vector actually satisfies all the requirements for vector harmonics. Okay. And satisfies a new Laplace-Beltrami equation. The only difference now is that the effective wave number is a different one from the original ones, from K and N. Okay. And it is related through this expression. Okay. So what you can say is that you have the two waves interacting, they produce a new wave. The new wave, of course, has a different properties than the original one. And this relation here, that comes from the harmonics that you use, can give you an idea of how these changes go. So the wave number of the new wave, the electromagnetic wave, depends on the wave numbers of the gravitational wave, the old signal, and also on the interaction angle of the two wave vectors. Okay. So in principle, if you know the wavelengths of the two interacting waves, and if you know the angle one hits the other, you can calculate the wavelength of the new signal. Okay. So what we're going to do is take these decompositions and put them back to the first equation. The process is the same with the second, so I'm just going to stick with the electric wave equation, and it looks like this. That's the new wave, that's the old wave, that's the gravitational wave. The old wave satisfies this equation, the gravitational wave satisfies this equation. You have dot derivatives here. So what you do is you actually take the derivatives of these solutions, and for a moment let's assume that the phases are zero. We will include them again but later, but for the moment let's say that they are zero. And then the source term looks like this. Okay, and the constants here depend on the initial conditions. These are the amplitudes and these are the wave numbers of the original waves. Okay, and now you can solve this equation and see if it gives you any resonances or not. And let's take the even simpler case. Let's assume that the original waves have the same wavelength, and of course the phases are still zero. That's how the wave equation looks like. Okay, these are the initial conditions here. This is the effective wave number of the interaction of the source term, which in our case is twice k, because k and n are the same. Okay, and that's the solution. And you can see that you have resonance when L and N get very close. Okay, the amplitude of the induced wave actually diverges. All right. And because you know the relation that L has with K and N, or with M, effectively, you can actually substitute and rewrite this expression like this. And you see there that you get resonance when these two waves, the original waves, which have the same wavelength, of course, propagate in the same direction. Then you get this type of resonance. Okay. Now let's make things a little bit more general. So suppose that the two wavelengths of the original waves are not the same, they're different. And suppose that phases are not zero, and they're also different from each other. You get again the same result qualitatively, although now the equation is a bit more complicated. Again, you get resonances in two cases which effectively correspond to these waves, the original waves, which have different wave lengths, like I said, propagating once in the same direction and once in the opposite direction. Okay, so you can see that with this simple analysis on a very simple background, which is the Minkowski space, you can show that first of all, you can show that there is an interaction between these two sources, the electromagnetic wave and the gravitational wave, which is not surprising, of course, we knew that from the beginning. You show that this interaction produces a new wave which actually oscillates driven by the gravito-magnetic interaction, which is also expected. And so you have a forced oscillation. You can show that at least in some special conditions, these forced oscillations can actually give you resonances, actually textbook resonances, like the ones that you find in textbooks. Okay. And this is not surprising, like I said, in principle at least, because that's where you expect to find resonances, when you have one wave interacting with another wave. All right, you have forced vibration. Which means that in principle, at least, it is possible for weak gravitational waves to amplify electromagnetic signals. How strong the amplification could be? Well, I don't really know. It depends on the conditions. It won't be infinite, that's for sure. So the question is, of course, whether this happens in the interstellar space, where you can approximate it with Minkowski, or under control conditions in the lab, where again you can use effectively Minkowski space. Okay. Now, the underlying, I think, statement is that you expect to find this type of behavior, this type of resonances, because you are dealing with forced oscillations. Okay. So the basic physics, this means that the basic physics do not actually depend on the background that you are using, whether it is Minkowski or something else. But of course the specifics of the interaction depend on the background, and perhaps if the background is more complicated, it's impossible to find these things analytically.
But if you're not in Minkowski, if it's expanding, then it would
that's the next.
then it would go a different way.
Yeah, that's right. Because, okay, in principle, the physics are the same, interaction between two waves, but if the background changes, the specifics of the interaction may change as well, for the better, or for the worse, depending what you think is better or worse. So the next step is to employ another background, which is more complicated than Minkowski, but it's still simple. And the next one is cosmological background, which is Friedmann, Robertson, Walker. So we'll try to see, and this will be quite quick, how this coupling between these two fields actually progresses or proceeds in cosmology. And we'll assume that the background now is a spatially flat FRW universe. And these are the equations that actually describe this background. That's the Friedmann equation. That's a version of the Friedmann equation, effectively the time derivative of this, which is known as the Marani-Suduri equation as well. And the last one is the continuity equation. Okay. Now h is the Hubble parameter, a is the scale factor, which gives you a measure of the dimensions of your universe. Rho is the density of the matter, P is the pressure, if you have pressure, and W is the barotropic index of your fluid. Okay. So once you know these equations, you can solve them actually, and you can find how the model defends, assuming some value for W. Okay.
So for your expanded acceleration,
Accelerated expansion.
accelerated expansion, W is negative, right? Or what?
If you assume dark energy, yes.
Even time dependent.
Yeah. So if you have this model, in order to make this thing positive, okay, you have to make this term negative, and you can only make it if W is
Yes.
negative as well. Okay. But this is an exact FRW, no perturbations at all, which is a very serious constraint actually, because the universe that we live, at least on a certain scale, which we believe is 100 megaparsecs, maybe more than that, is definitely not Friedmann original. That's for sure.
Well, you just, didn't you make an assumption about FRW?
Yeah. I made an assumption here because I'm talking about large scales now.
Yes.
Very large.
Yeah, which might not be right in our universe even.
That is true.
Yeah.
Well, in principle, we can never tell if the whole universe is FRW because we can never see the whole universe.
No.
So strictly speaking, we will never know unless we live an infinite life and see the whole universe at the end. Okay. But the current cosmological model assumes that the scale of homogeneity or not homogeneity, the way you look at it, is around 100 megaparsec. After 100 megaparsec, the homogeneity of the universe starts appearing, becoming below, inside the 100 megaparsec, the universe is less and less homogeneous and less FRW. Okay. However, there have been some recent, I'm going completely off, there have been some recent observations suggesting that this homogeneity scale may actually be much larger, 500 perhaps all the way to 1,000. But that's another story. Okay.
It would be interesting if any of this has any implications on a different explanation of dark energy, of course. But that
Possibly.
But that you're not alluding to here.
No.
But this is a different explanation. We have one explanation of that.
A different explanation for the accelerated expansion, you mean,
Cosmological
rather than dark energy.
Which would require that you are very far away from an FRW.
Well, there are actually scenarios that have been proposed, which actually, but maybe I shouldn't say. Anyway, let me go on.
Yeah, we do it some other time.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so this is the background. So we present this background with gravitational and electromagnetic waves. This is the evolution for the SEER, the wave equation. Again, the SEER is enough to describe gravitational waves, but now there's not zero on the right-hand side. There are source terms which reflect the fact that we have expansion and we have matter. Okay, so it's not Minkowski anymore. And in the same way, the Maxwell's equations give you a different evolution for your electric and magnetic field. The magnetic field is a very important one. It tells you that to linear order it drops like a to the minus 2. This is the so-called adiabatic magnetic decay. A is the scale factor. Okay, so it depletes with time. And you can study the interaction of these sources at second order again. And then the equation for the magnetic field, the equation of motion, or the wave equation if you like, looks like that. That's the new magnetic field. And there are extra terms again because of the expansion of matter. And this is the source term that comes from the interaction of the gravitational waves and the linear magnetic field with the tilde down there. So again, we have driven forced oscillation. That's the driving source, which is of gravito-magnetic origin. And again, you can introduce splitting like the one that I have shown before. And then this system of these two vast equations looks like that. That's for the SEER, the gravitational waves, and that's for your gravitationally induced magnetic field. And for the electric field, it will be exactly the same. Sorry. And you can actually solve this system analytically. Not in the dust era, unfortunately, but during the radiation era you can do that. And this is probably enough because towards the end of the radiation era, a lot of astrophysically interesting scales enter the horizon. Okay. And if you solve it, you assume that you have radiation and you solve it, you come up with this solution for your magnetic field. And you see that it oscillates. Okay. Something that I forgot to say. I will say that. It oscillates, but the amplitude drops like a to the minus 2 again. So the adiabatic decay remains. But there is one significant difference, which comes. This is the sine integral function. This is the cosine integral function. And the difference, the significant difference, comes from this function, because when the argument of this function is 0, then it diverges. So when L and K, these two wave numbers actually coincide, you get again a resonant amplification of your magnetic field. Okay. Now this actually equation, I should say that, holds, and this one, I should have said it, and this one. There are no electric terms there. This holds during the horizon process. So these are large-scale gravitational waves, large-scale magnetic fields. They have been produced during inflation or before inflation. Inflation took them and stretched them out where they outside the horizon. They were no longer in causal contact there. They froze in as classical gravitational waves and electromagnetic fields. That's the argument anyway. And then gradually, as the universe goes into the radiation, they start coming inside the horizon. Okay. Now, outside the horizon, the conductivity is very low because of inflation. Inside the horizon, because the radiation era has started, the conductivity goes up. So outside there are electric fields, inside there are no electric fields. It's MHD, ideally MHD more or less. So as these wavelengths now, the scales start coming inside the horizon, okay, during that period, which is brief in cosmological sense, the currents that operate inside the horizon start eliminating the electric fields. The electric fields get weaker. So in this argument, you can drop the electric terms from your equation, arguing that they are higher order in effect. Okay, and if you do that, then you get this solution. And if you don't do it, you don't get any analytical solutions. Okay, and this solution shows resonance, but this resonance is different than the other because it has a very sharp peak. So it's the previous one was like this. If you like, this is like this. Okay, because of the the cosine integral function. Okay, what is the reason for this change, this qualitative change? The reason is the expansion. The fact that this the expansion acts as a friction term, as a brake. Okay, this source term actually drops with time because of the expansion, whereas the source terms in the Minkowski case didn't have any time dependence. Okay, didn't decay with time. That's the point. Okay, so you can actually change the shape and go back to this one if you slow down the decay of the source term. And you can do that either by slowing down the decay of your shear or by slowing down the decay of your linear magnetic field, or both. Okay. So for example, here we have assumed that this quantity there drops, the magnetic field drops like 8 to the minus 2. If you assume that drops like 8 to the minus 1, for example, and magnetic fields that do that have been produced in some high energy physics scenarios, then the decay rate of that source term is slower, and you go back to this textbook-like resonance. Okay, so in principle, you find the same thing, a bit different because now your background has changed, but again, you can see the possibility of a strong amplification of magnetic fields, in this case, large-scale magnetic fields, from gravitational waves of cosmological origin, both of them actually. All right. So, given that, and given the two facts. First, that the universe is full, it's filled actually with electromagnetic radiation, and also have seen large-scale magnetic fields more or less everywhere. Okay. It looks like when we have the technology to observe them, we have found them, or where we have the technology to observe them. And given also the fact that we have not detected gravitational waves so far, assuming that they actually exist, okay? And given this interaction, which tells you there is some kind of energy transfer from the gravitational wave to the electromagnetic wave, from the biofield to the Maxwell field, one might wonder whether this ubiquitous presence of magnetic and electromagnetic fields in the universe has at least partly been achieved at the expense of gravitational radiation. Okay. And so, in a way, one could wonder if this interaction is actually quite common in the universe in general. If this is true, probably it isn't, then detecting gravitational waves would be actually more difficult than we think, if they actually have the tendency to transfer their energy to magnetic energy, electromagnetic energy. Okay. And I think that's how I would like to end this.
Thank you. Any questions, please?
But you have a resonance, so design a laboratory experiment in which you can create
Give me the money and I will do that.
an electromagnetic field which creates gravitational waves.
No, the other way around.
No, you should do it because you suppose that the present methodology is perhaps problematic because the electromagnetic field is robbing
That's a
the universe
possibility.
of gravitational radiation.
Well, theoretically, it's a possibility, but of course, I suspect that the opposite may also be true. Here I looked at the effect of gravitational radiation on electromagnetic waves. In the same way, or in another way, one could look at the effect of electromagnetic waves in gravitational waves. And there we have again an interaction between a wave and a wave, and again we might get some resonances. If this is true, then it's an issue of saturation, which actually, if there is some kind of saturation level for this interaction. Okay. But the second problem is more difficult, I think, technically to address, because here the equations are relatively simple. The other ones are not as simple, in my opinion, or at least in this context.
But this underlying question here, what signatures would you expect from some of your electromagnetism that's generated by or amplified by the existing or presumed gravitational radiation?
All right, so it's a hypothetical scenario, actually.
I see that.
Yeah. Suppose that you know, or you can guess, have a good guess of what kind of frequency or amplitude wavelength the gravitational waves coming from a specific source may have. Then assume that you have an apparatus which produces electromagnetic waves of the same frequency, and then you sit there and wait to see a sudden increase in your electromagnetic field. If it happens, then you might say, okay, this might be a gravitational wave. That's a very simple scenario. Now, as far as cosmology is concerned, it might actually give you, there's a problem in explaining the large-scale magnetic field that we see in the universe. Okay. It's difficult actually to create magnetic fields that can sustain the galactic dynamo. And recently there were some observations talking about magnetic fields of the order of 10 to the minus 15 in spaces, empty space knowledge, where the dynamo supposedly cannot work.
That's between clusters, yeah.
That's right.
The runoff.
That's right,
The
correct.
runoff,
So if this has it been confirmed? Is it?
there are theoretical issues, perhaps. But, I mean, many people believe in that lower limit, which is
That's right.
minus 15 gauss.
So this is quite strong. So how do you explain that? We cannot actually explain it. So if you find, and people are trying to find ways of actually amplifying the weak electromagnetic fields that potential inflation can produce. But they always use methods, or in most of the cases, use methods which either change gravity, or general relativity, or electromagnetism. So one wonders if we do have to do that, change, introduce new physics, or maybe there are some other classical ways of solving the problem without having to break away from standard Maxwellian electromagnetism or standard GR. So this goes along these lines, this attempt to see if we can do it without actually any physics.
I think what I wonder is also if you use the early cosmological gravitational waves as the kind of driver here, what would be the characteristics of the electromagnetism in terms of scales or scale freeness?
Instead of, in terms of scale,
Yeah.
how large they would be. That's what I mean, what would be the coherence length of your magnetic field. Given that this interaction, assuming that it works, of course, which is very unlikely, around horizon crossing, then you would expect something like that.
Yeah.
It will work actually on all scales as they cross the horizon. So you find a large scale magnetic field. It should be more or less scale invariant spectrum.
Exactly.
like
That's,
that,
that's,
yeah.
But what would be the source be of the gravitational waves?
What do you mean the source? Inflation.
Inflation.
Yeah, that's right.
So
both
that's a very large. That corresponds to the large scale. So
Collapse,
that's why
right,
we're
they're
saying
very
scale
large.
invariant
So
spectrum.
they have been stressed out
Yeah.
very large scales. Both the electromagnetic and the gravitational.
Yeah. Yeah. So not any phase transition. They don't.
You mean during the radiation era, some kind of phase transition to generate? No.
May I ask
Yeah.
one question? You say repeatedly, if it works, which I doubt, or which I don't think. Okay.
Because this is a very simple toy model, right?
Yeah.
So you probably followed that I have made a number of
Yes.
assumptions in order to get analytical solutions. And usually life doesn't work this way, or it makes things more difficult than you actually want. So this is one of the reasons actually that I'm here, to see if it is possible to use numerical techniques that the group here has developed and include these terms that I actually have dropped, and see if we can get something similar or something close to that. Okay. Because this is a toy model, nothing more than that.
So that raises maybe a question to the first grade physics students. What is a pendulum going to do if you're excited and a bit resonantly? How quickly will it grow? We checked that, of course, and we didn't believe each other.
I think we.
So does John know the answer to that?
How quickly? What's the time scale?
Yeah, what's the amplitude? How does if you are in resonance, then we know that the amplitude of the resonator that you're exciting resonantly should be infinite. But that's at an infinite time, is it not?
Yeah, you never reach that.
Yes. So that's what I'm asking. What is how does it grow in time, the amplitude? Does it grow linearly or exponentially, or something else?
Linearly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You think if you start from zero, or if it's already oscillating?
No, you start with zero.
Well, that's the thing, is you don't start from zero.
You start from somewhere, and then it grows like this. Right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's.
I think. Well, okay.
Even if the
we
textbook
will
says it's
have-
infinite, it's only like this.
You mean
That's not in the textbook somehow, this kind of curve.
I wouldn't think so, but I think that the equation, what it tells you, if you have two oscillations, so you don't actually start exciting something that is sitting there. Okay. If you have two oscillations and there's nothing else actually, friction forces or anything, then theoretically, if you manage to get the right frequency, then you have a very strong result.
You have a what?
A very strong result. Okay. But not,
But
you don't have the pendulum sitting there, and then you start pushing it around. You have it oscillate. Okay. And then you go and exert a force with exactly the proper frequency.
Yeah.
Then I think you will see a strong effect immediately, and it won't go like that. That's my impression.
Done by this, and I have to.
If you start from zero, yes, of course, it takes some time, because you can't actually start.
I'm not leaving in protest, I'm just leaving to make a phone call.
All right. Okay.
Okay, any other questions? Would that be a problem if it's only linearly growing?
Then it doesn't look like a resonance to me, because you can actually see sometimes the effects, and they're quite fast. Okay. But I think that even the numerics should be able to show that. I tried something actually with CK, and I
Yes.
saw something
Uh-huh.
faster than that, but you
Yeah.
have to make sure that it's...
So what do you find, CK?
What?
We saw something similar to that.
But,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
we checked, I think I asked you, and we checked the inclination of that, and it was changing, it was becoming sharper as we were.
Okay. Yeah, but they still do the excess look control, but then.
It was still in it?
And the envelope was T, it's a half T in some units.
So, yeah,
I think when everything is one, then the envelope was half T.
Okay, well, I maintain my reservations, but of course, if it is so, it is so.
Yes, anyway, we should study this further, of course, and look at the rest of the
Indeed.
terms. Good. Any other questions? Okay, if that's the case, then let's thank Christos again.